The message that I have this morning started off with a visit to a lighthouse in South Africa, and I'm not sure where I'm at the moment with this, but it's coming. All right, maybe I should start at the beginning of 2019. We're away, good. We decided that we would, here we go. We decided that we would go on a bit of a cruise. We didn't know the risks that would be involved at the time, and as we got along a week or so into the cruise, we started hearing about a ship called the Ruby Princess, and then we started hearing about the Diamond Princess. And then, would you believe, when we got to Singapore, they wanted to take our temperatures when we got off the boat, and we thought this was way over the top. By the time we got to one of the islands there, they decided that they should give us a warm welcome. So they even lit a fire in our honour. This was a little bit upsetting because they chose to light the fire in the middle of the road. So it probably wasn't to keep us warm, but it was to try and keep us out of their island. But yes, when we got back, it was really taking off. We got off the boat in Perth on the 10th of March, and on the 10th of March somebody else got on the boat for the rest of the voyage through to Sydney, and that was when the Sun Princess was introduced to COVID. So we were rather grateful to the Lord that we got off in Perth and didn't extend our journey. Anyway, one of the places that we visited, oops, I know it the wrong way, was the Cape of Good Hope, a place that I had heard about but never expected to visit. Has quite a lot of history. The first recorded person to have gone around the Cape was Bartholomew Diaz, and he was round the Cape before he realised it. His crew was threatening to mutiny because a lot of things had gone wrong and the food hadn't been too good, and he got caught in a gale, and the crew were trying to get him to go back, but by the time they were able to sort of settle down a little bit, they discovered that they were way around the Cape and they were on their way. There is evidence of much earlier ships having gone around, but that's the one that is sort of recorded and celebrated over there of the Cape. Now, did I go? Oh no, that's good. That is Bellows Rock. Bellows Rock was responsible for a few shipwrecks and was possibly why they decided that they needed a lighthouse on the island. That's a closer up one. I tried to get a better one but couldn't find it, so I stuck with my own. The lighthouse was built around the 1860s, and there's a few little shots of it there. For those of you who are interested in lighthouses, there's a little giveaway that you look for whenever you look at a lighthouse. If it looks as if the glass is there and nobody's home, it's been decommissioned, because the early lighthouses used to have lenses that used to float on mercury. And that's actually why a lot of the lighthouse keepers were known for their mental instability, because mercury is a cause of that. But they used to float these lenses on mercury, and if the lens is missing, you know that the lighthouse has been decommissioned. And they do that because it's only a few minutes in the sun and things could get very hot where the focus of the lens is. And so they take the lenses out fairly quickly when they decommission them. So there's a rather impressive lighthouse in a very impressive spot. The old Cape Point Lighthouse really had promise. It had it had a mission, because As you saw there, Bellows Rock was quite a dangerous thing. It's not something you would want to encounter. So it had a mission to save other shipping in the area. It had location. It had an altitude of 262 metres. It had visibility. I don't know what the old lighthouse was. It had a number of wicks and burnt oil. The one that replaced it has a range of 73 kilometres, so it's a reasonable sort of range. All right, it was close to danger and it was equipped. It was solid construction. You have a look at it today, it's 160 years old and it's still in very good shape. The light had 12,000 candle power, or you've got the thing in lumens there, and it had a consistent pattern. It had a message. It had a signal that it sent out. So the old Cape Point Lighthouse really had potential. Now, fairly early in the piece, people started to complain. But we always complain, don't we? The mariners started to complain because they said, first of all I missed out. The people who manned the lighthouse complained because the weather was very bad down there and they didn't always get their food supply. So some of them jolly near starved to death. It was difficult to get the oil down there too to burn in the lamp. So the lighthouse keepers complained. The mariners also complained because they said, look, it's just not doing the job for us. And there were a lot of these complaints, but they actually came to a head on the 18th of April 1911. Now, when the SS Lusitania, not to be confused with I think it was the RMS Lusitania that was sunk and just before the start of World War II, which was sort of regarded as a forerunner of the Titanic. This one was the Portuguese liner, and as you can see there, it had all of these different passengers on it. And it came around the corner and it didn't see the light. And it came to grief, and I think that picture actually shows it coming to grief on Bellows Rock. And as you can see there were some lives lost. Did it show on the screen there? Yes, 8. There were 774 passengers and 8 of them perished. So that really brought things to a head. They said, maybe we'd better listen to the complaints. Now, the light set on the hill had been hidden. Now, generally speaking, the lighthouse was visible, so it did serve some function. In fog, when it was needed most, the signal was obscured. The bad news was that there were around about 900 hours per year when the lighthouse was obscured by fog. Now you work that out, it's not quite three hours a day, but it's more than 2 hours a day. So there was a problem. And as I mentioned, it all came to a head when the Lusitania ended up being broken on it. All right, that is my introductory part, and that is leading into, I saw this as a metaphor, if you like, of another time and another place. The Lusitania was headed for shipwreck, and there was a kingdom in biblical times that appeared to be headed for spiritual shipwreck. And we're picking it up here in 1 Kings and the 16th chapter. I won't read this through slavishly, but it would be a very good thing for you to follow because there are extensive passages Too much to put on the screen. The first ones I have, but as things progress, we will move more to, if you like, the written word rather than the projected word, if you like. It starts off with verse 30 of Acts chapter 16 with Ahab. Now, Ahab was certainly not the best king that Israel had ever had. Mind you, this is the northern kingdom. And to complete things, he did have a woman in his life who became proverbial for doing the wrong thing. And her name was Jezebel, obviously. And in verse 32, it mentions there that he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the worship of some of these ancient deities involved some behaviours that would be considered rather unacceptable in our day and age, apart from the fact that they were worshipping a false god. The worship of Baal we would regard as being totally unacceptable, I would hope, in this day and age, although you never can tell, can you, when you get around to it. All right, and he made this wooden image that's mentioned there, and actually the chapter does end where it mentions that in his time Jericho was rebuilt, and Jericho there'd been a curse placed on anyone who rebuilt Jericho. So when does it happen? During Ahab's time. Now, I've skipped over a little bit here. Chapter 17 deals with the drought, but while that is relevant in many contexts, it's not exactly where I wanted to put the emphasis today. But there was a long drought where Elijah was miraculously preserved, and he had to hide for several years. And we're now coming to the end of that drought, and we have, if you like, Elijah's lighthouse opportunity. It's his opportunity to spread the message. We find the context there starting in verse 2, I think it is. Actually, no, sorry, we've got to get along a little bit. Verse 17, sorry. We've got the encounter with Ahab. And it didn't get off to a very good start, does it? Did it? All right. Then it happened when Ahab saw Elijah. Now remember, Ahab's the king, Elijah's the prophet. Ahab said to him, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" Not really the way to start a conversation with God's messenger, is it? So he was off to a bit of a bad start. And Elijah was a fairly forthright person and put him down, as you'll notice in verse 18, and says, "No, it's not me, it's you and your family." But do you notice that he didn't spend a lot of time berating Ahab? Because that wasn't going to do any good. He then moved fairly quickly into positive steps. And this is where where he moves into delivering his message. And in verse 20, "So Ahab sent all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel. And Elijah came to all the people and said, 'How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him.' But the people answered him not a word." And then he proposes to them a challenge. He's going to have a showdown with them, and he wants to demonstrate to them who is the true God. But not only that, he wants them to make a decision. He wants them to make a decision for God. So he tells them he alone is there. You've got 450 prophets there in verse 22. And in verse 23, he gives the challenge. And basically the challenge was that there would be 2 altars, there would be 2 sacrifices. And the God who answered by fire, he would be the God that would be the one who was to be worshipped, and that was the way it was going to be. And so we find there that they all gathered together, and that was how it all went. Just moving on, still in the 18th chapter, verse 21, you've got the challenge to choose. The test is proposed, and I'm a little bit interested in the response of the worshippers or the people there in verse 26. So they took the bull which was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But guess what? No. And I understand Elijah had to be a little bit alert because there might have been some strange fire that didn't come down from heaven, and he had to guard against that. Now, we find a little bit longer, a bit further on, we find that in verses 30 and onwards, after they had tried and tried and tried and failed, and remember they'd tried by jumping around and cutting themselves, and so you've got blood everywhere. It wouldn't have been a very pleasant scene. So at the end of all this, and I can imagine Elijah doing this very calmly, saying to the people, this is verse 30, come near to me. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. Then he took the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes and built an altar. And verse 33, he puts it all together. And then he calls the people around and says, okay, go get some barrels of water. Not sure where he got them from, because remember they were in the middle of this huge drought. Anyway, they managed to do it. So they filled 4 water pots with water and poured it on the burnt sacrifice on the wood. Now, I don't know whether you've ever tried to light a campfire in the wet, have you? I haven't been markedly successful. I have many failures, but that has been one of the more spectacular ones, trying to light a campfire in the wet. So he did it a second time, and I think he did it a third time, and so the water was running all around the altar. And so it's a bit of an extra challenge, isn't it? Now in verse 38, it starts to get a little bit first of all we need to go back a little bit. Elijah prays, and this is his prayer in verse 36. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now, I've had a few campfires, and I've burnt a little bit of wood, but I've never yet managed to burn the stones, let alone wet stones. So, as I put it there on the overhead, God sent out a flash, and it was a flash like no lighthouse ever sent out. Now, the important thing is, why did God do it? God did it to get a response, did he not? All right, verse 39. Now, when the people saw it and fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. So they responded. Then Elijah responds. And this is one of the things, I don't know that this is what I would have been doing, but it's what Elijah did, and obviously it was the right thing to do. There are some things we were discussing in our Sabbath school lesson this morning that we don't understand. And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. 450 of them. So there's a bit of a message there. So let's have a look in verse 41 now. And in verse 41, they're looking for another signal. Because then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." And he went up to eat, etc. And we come down to verse 43, where the servant is told, "Go look towards the sea." And he said, "There is nothing." 7 times he said, "Go again." And on the last time, in verse 44, the 7th time that he said, "There is a cloud as small as a man's hand rising out of the sea." So they got their signal. What does he do? He said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." And then, now it happened in the same time that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was heavy rain. So Abraham rode away and went to Jezreel, and the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Now my 8-year-old grandson challenged me to beat him to the gate. I was flat out beating my grandson. Elijah ran in front of Ahab's chariot into Jezreel. Do you think there's evidence of some miracles on that day? And what do miracles do? Miracles build faith, don't they? And so we've got Elijah, and he's got all this evidence of God's presence with him, and he's come to the end of the day. And there's a little bit of a cloud on the horizon. Because if we go into the next chapter, chapter 19, we find there is a lady who is a very influential lady, and she's not appreciative of what Elijah has done. And if you do the right thing, strange as it may seem, not always is it appreciated. Anyway, when Jezebel heard all about this, she sent a messenger to Elijah and said, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them," referring to the prophets of Baal, pardon me, that he had executed, by tomorrow about this time. Pardon me. So here's Elijah. He has seen all of this evidence of God's leading, of his promise, of his miraculous intervention. And what's he do? Let's have a look. Verse 3. When he saw that, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. I've expressed it there as fog envelops Elijah. This fantastic message, the unbelievable way in which God had used him to start a revival, and when he's needed to carry it on, and he's gone AWOL. Now, it's all very well for me. I'm a mortal person. Elijah was translated without seeing death. So there is a certain amount of irony about me pointing out Elijah's shortcomings. But let's acknowledge that the best of us our faith can fail, and none of us is invincible if we let go of the Lord. Okay, verses 5 to 8. Then as he lay and he slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him. And an angel supports him with food. You'll find in verse 6. There was this food, and the angel came back a second time and said, "Time to get up and eat. The journey is too great." And on the strength of that food, in verse 8, how long does he go? Man, it must have been some food, mustn't it? He went 40 days on the strength of that food. Now, I'm beginning to sort of like Elijah because I experience frustration at times, and most of my frustrations are minor. But you'll notice in verse 9, the Lord says to him, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah vents some of his frustration in verse 10. "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I'm the only one left, and they seek to take my life too." Did God argue with him? I don't think Elijah was in the mood for argument. But the Lord calmly gave him an instruction. He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore at the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. Now, I've never seen rock-breaking winds, but it appeared there, and the Lord was not in the wind, and there was an earthquake, and then there was the fire, and there was a still small voice. Now, fortunately, Elijah he was now in a frame of mind to listen, and he wrapped his face in a mantle, and the voice came to him, and he again said, "What have you been..." Sorry, I've gotten out of it there. The Lord anyway spoke to him and told him to go back, verse 15. "Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king of Assyria, Jehu king of Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat as a prophet in your place." Now, it is true that after this experience, his successor was appointed. But Elijah had been given a charter for going forward. And that charter's in verses 15 to 21, and he picked up that charter. The important thing is that Elijah, while he had let the Lord down to a certain extent, the Lord hadn't rejected him. No, we won't go there. Elijah had an opportunity waiting. As it's pointed out there, with the slaying of the prophets of Baal, the way was open for the carrying forward of a mighty reformation amongst the 10 tribes. And if he had stayed there, he would have been part of it, because a moment comes, and there is a moment to hit things, and that moment basically passed while he wasn't there. So the opportunity was missed. He should have met the threat of Jezebel with an appeal to protection for the one who had commissioned him, And he should have told the messenger that God in whom he trusted would have protected him, and that would have resulted in a huge reformation. But unfortunately, that did not happen. All right, back to the old lighthouse. As soon as they could after the wrecking of the Lusitania, they built another lighthouse and they decommissioned that magnificent structure. If I'd been the one that had part in building it, I would have been extremely disappointed. But it wasn't doing the job consistently, and they replaced it with another structure 87 metres lower. And just in passing, there could be a bit of a message there. If we try to deliver the gospel from some elevated position, it is possible that the message will get obscured from the clouds in front of the ivory towers, and the message is not going to get through. But that's incidental. The old lighthouse of 262 metres could be seen too early. All right. What happened was that this lighthouse was on a cape. It was meant to warn shipping from a certain direction. But because of its elevation, it could be seen, and they could see the lighthouse straight ahead and say, oh yeah, that's right, no worries, and they tended to turn too soon. So the lighthouse, if you like, tended to get in the way of the message. Too much information. There is a place to hold one's tongue. So the message, because it was too visible, too exalted, the message could be seen from places that wasn't supposed to be, and the messages were getting confused because of the elevation of the lighthouse, and so that was another problem. The foggy, yes, we mentioned that, didn't we? The older one was often invisible to shipping. The old Cape Point lighthouse was partially effective, but it was decommissioned because its inadequacies could not be remedied. It did some good, but it didn't do enough good, if you like. It wasn't consistent enough. There was nothing could be done about it, and so it was abandoned. Oh, magnificent tourist attraction, but as a lighthouse, it became useless, a relic. And so there you've got it there. I'd like to be able to tell you that I climbed up to the lighthouse, but we had very limited time there, so I didn't follow those people up to the lighthouse, and I risked life and limb to get that second photo there. One had to sort of look around the edge a little bit, but you can see that tiny, humble little lighthouse that replaced that big, imposing lighthouse and did a far better job because it didn't let the building get in the way of the message. Now, there were some important differences, and I think we've covered these. Yes, Elijah was instructed to appoint a successor after the experience, but he was not decommissioned. God did not give up on Elijah. Elijah's lapse was remedied, but the lighthouse's problem was incurable. Elijah's problem did not relate to ego, but aspects of the lighthouse's visibility caused confusion. So there were some very important differences. So, the summary: consistency is necessary in the Christian walk, and if we consistently fail, then the Lord has some problems using us, doesn't he? God did not reject Elijah for a momentary lapse. If Elijah had exalted himself, God would have been restricted in how he could use him. God restored and supported Elijah. And God continued to use Elijah and valued him as a leader and a mentor. And I think that's the last one. And this is my concluding... Oh, this is supposed to animate. Here we go. If I both know how to be abased and know how to abound everywhere and in all things, I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And if we're prepared to do that, like Elijah was, like Paul was, then the Lord will be able to use us fully in his service. May this be the experience of each one of us.